Eleanor Marsh's fingers were bleeding when she unsealed the letter. Not from fear. From the wire she'd wrapped around the ledger books beneath her petticoat, wrapped so tight during 3 days of running that the metal had cut through her skin without her noticing. 7 years of Harrison Vance's stolen money recorded in her own handwriting. 7 years of evidence he needed destroyed. And Eleanor had carried every page of it across 400 miles of open country, bleeding the whole way, because some truths were worth dying for. Before we continue, please subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the very end. Drop a comment below telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's get back to Eleanor. The stagecoach from Billings arrived in Redstone Crossing on a Tuesday in November, 40 minutes late, and dragging a broken wheel rim that screamed against the frozen road like something in pain. Caleb Hargrove heard it from the porch of the post office where he'd been waiting on a delivery of fence wire. He didn't move right away. Men who'd spent years reading trouble had learned not to rush toward noise until they understood what made it. There were 3 passengers. 2 men in city coats who stepped down fast and headed straight for the warmth of the saloon without looking at anyone. The 3rd passenger took longer. She didn't step down so much as she fell forward, catching the doorframe with one hand. Then the wheel spoke with the other, lowering herself to the ground, with the kind of careful deliberateness that told Caleb her body was arguing with every movement she asked of it. She was carrying a carpet bag in one hand, and had a second bag strapped across her chest with a leather cord. That second bag she never let touch the coach wall, never let the other passengers brush against. She held it the way a person holds something they'd rather die than lose. She looked up and down the main street of Redstone Crossing once. Her eyes were gray and flat and tired in a way that had nothing to do with the journey. Caleb pushed off the post office wall and crossed the street. "Miss Whitfield." He used the name from the advertisement response. "I'm Caleb Hargrove." She turned toward him, and he saw it, then the thing she'd been trying to hide since she stepped off that coach. Her left hand gripping the bag strap was wrapped in cloth. Dark stains at the knuckles. Not fresh blood. Old blood that had soaked through and dried and soaked through again. "Mr. Hargrove." Her voice was controlled and precise. "Thank you for meeting me." "Your hand." The journey was long. She said it like that explained everything and closed the subject at the same time. Caleb had spent 3 years as a private investigator before he came back to Montana. He'd learned in that time that the way a person deflected told you more than what they said. Eleanor Marsh. She'd signed the letter Eleanor Marsh not. Whitfield deflected like someone who'd been doing it so long it had become instinct. "I'll take your bag," he said. She pulled back half an inch. Just half an inch. But it was there. "Just the one," he said, quietly reaching for the carpet bag. "Not the one on the cord. That one he didn't touch." Something shifted in her expression too fast to name. She let him take the carpet bag. "The wagon's this way," he said. She walked beside him without speaking. He noticed she positioned herself slightly to his right, keeping his gun hand in her peripheral vision. He noticed she clocked every doorway they passed. He noticed her breathing changed when a man on the boardwalk moved suddenly to avoid a loose board underfoot. Her whole body went rigid for 2 full seconds before she recovered. Caleb said nothing. He'd seen that kind of vigilance before. It didn't come from one bad day. It came from a long education in how fast a safe situation could turn. The wagon ride to the Hargrove Ranch took 25 minutes. The road cut north through flat land and then rose into the first foothills before dropping into the valley where the ranch sat. November had already stripped the willows along the creek bare. The sky was the color of old tin. Eleanor sat straight-backed and watched the landscape like she was memorizing it. "You been to Montana before?" Caleb asked. "No." "Spent your whole life in Denver?" A pause. "Most of it." "Cold gets different up here. Different from city cold. Gets into the joints." "I'll manage." He believed her. Whatever else Eleanor Marsh was, she wasn't delicate. "Ranch isn't large," he said. 3 hired men. Tom Birch handles the stock, Curtis Wade does the fence work and repairs, old Pete Dalloway cooks and complains about cooking in roughly equal measure. Something almost crossed her face. Not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood of one. The house has a good stove, Caleb continued. Bedroom at the top of the stairs. Lock on the door. She turned to look at him directly for the first time since they'd left town. You said that like it was something I'd need to know. I said it like it's true. She looked at him for another moment, then turned back to the road. All right, she said. The house was plain and well kept. Eleanor walked through the front room and the kitchen, with her eyes moving to corners and windows the way water finds the lowest point in a room. She tested the weight of the back door, how fast it opened. She looked at the lock on the bedroom and turned the key in it twice. Caleb stood in the hallway and watched none of this openly, but he saw it. Supper's at 6, he said. Pete makes biscuits. They're better than they look. I'll be down. She had her hand on the bedroom door. Miss Marsh? She stopped. That bag on the cord. If you want it locked somewhere safe, I've got a strong box in the study. Combination lock. Nobody else has the combination. The silence that followed lasted long enough that Caleb heard the wind pick up outside. Why would you offer that, she said, to someone you met 40 minutes ago? Because you've been guarding it since you stepped off the coach, and you look like you haven't slept properly in a week. And because a person doesn't carry something like that unless it matters more than their own comfort. Eleanor's jaw tightened, then loosened. I'll keep it with me for now. All right. But thank you. She said the last two words like she'd had to find them from somewhere far down. She went into the bedroom, and Caleb heard the lock turn. He went back downstairs and stood at the kitchen window for a long time, looking out at the gray sky and the dormant fields, thinking about old blood on wrapped hands and a leather bag that never left her body. Supper was the way Pete made it, plain and hot and plentiful. Eleanor ate like someone reminding themselves they were supposed to eat. Pete Dalloway, who at 63 had strong opinions about everything from weather to the territorial governor's hair, watched her for approximately 30 seconds before turning to Caleb. She's a quiet one. Pete, Caleb said. Just noting. Pete refilled his coffee. Quiet's fine. We could use more quiet around here, considering certain individuals who shall remain unnamed spend 20 minutes telling me how I should cook my own beans every single morning. He looked at Curtis Wade, who was 24, and had the grace to look at the ceiling. I like the beans, Eleanor said. Pete pointed his fork at her. Smart woman. After supper, Eleanor helped clear plates without being asked. When Pete tried to take the stack from her, she simply turned so he couldn't reach them and continued washing. Pete looked at Caleb. Caleb shrugged. Pete sat back down and finished his coffee with the expression of a man who has decided this particular battle is not worth fighting. When the last dish was put away, Eleanor dried her hands and said goodnight to the room in general and walked upstairs. The lock turned. Caleb heard the creak of the floorboards as she moved around the room above, then silence. Tom Birch, who had been quiet through the whole meal and was generally quiet about everything, looked up from his coffee. She's scared of something. That's her business, Caleb said. Tom nodded and went back to his coffee. It was past midnight when Caleb heard it. He'd been sitting at the kitchen table going over the account book for the fall cattle sale when the sound came from upstairs. Not crying, not movement. A voice low and urgent, the way a person talks to themselves in a nightmare when the nightmare has a specific shape. He didn't go upstairs. He sat at the table and listened until the voice stopped and the silence settled back over the house. Then he put another log on the stove and went back to the account book, and when the entry wouldn't add up for the third time in a row, he set the pen down and stared at the kitchen wall instead. In the morning, Eleanor came downstairs with her hair pinned back and her eyes clear and composed in the manner of someone who had thoroughly decided that the previous night did not exist. Sleep well? Caleb asked. Yes, thank you. They both let it stand. She asked to be shown the property after breakfast, which surprised him. Not the curiosity, the practicality of it. She walked the fence lines and asked specific questions. How many head? What the winter losses averaged? What the shortfall had been last season versus projected. Her questions weren't polite small talk. They were the questions of someone who understood numbers and wanted accurate ones. You did bookkeeping, Caleb said. In Denver. 7 years. She said it without looking at him. For a shipping and freight company. Vance Freight and Transport. She stopped walking. The silence was absolute. Not the quiet of the open land around them, but a different kind. The kind that happened when something true had been said out loud for the first time. Where did you hear that name? She said. Her voice had gone completely flat. I didn't. I guessed from context. Caleb watched her. I used to do investigative work. Old habit. Shipping company Denver, 7 years, a woman who wraps financial documents in wire against her skin and hasn't slept a full night in what looks like a month. There aren't many operations that size in Denver. Eleanor turned to face him. Her expression was not the terror he'd half expected. It was something more complicated and more controlled. How much do you actually know? Nothing yet. That's up to you. And if I chose to tell you nothing, then that's your right, he said. I don't demand explanations from people who come to work on my ranch. I'm not here to work on your ranch. I know that too. She looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved through the bare willows along the creek and carried the first real bite of coming snow. I answered your advertisement, she said slowly, because I needed to be somewhere a man with significant resources and significant connections in Denver would not think to look for me. The Montana territory seemed sufficiently remote. It is. I am not, she said carefully, what I presented myself to be in that letter. No. You knew. The handwriting was too precise and the words were too few. Professional habit. People who are used to written communication use more words. People who are choosing each word because they're aware they might be read by the wrong eyes use fewer. Eleanor stared at him. You are not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone easier to manage. Something that might have been amusement moved through Caleb's expression and was gone. I expect that's true. She turned and walked back toward the house without speaking again. But at the porch steps, she paused with her hand on the rail and without turning around said, His name is Harrison Vance. He owns the largest freight operation in Colorado and has partial ownership in 3 banks and a territorial judge. I have 7 years of financial records proving he has systematically defrauded over 60 individual ranchers and small business owners. The money runs to just over $140,000. Caleb said nothing. I took the records when I left his employ 3 weeks ago. Her knuckles were white on the rail. He told me if I ever mentioned what I'd seen, he would have me arrested for theft and embezzlement. He has the paperwork prepared to make that accusation stick. He has done it before to others. She stopped. I have the original ledgers. He has forgeries replacing them. In the eyes of the law at this moment, I am the criminal and he is the victim. All right, Caleb said. She did turn then. All right, that's all you have to say. You want me to say something else? I want... She stopped. Her grip on the rail loosened slightly. Most people would tell me to go to the authorities. The authorities answer to the territorial judge, who you just told me answers to Vance. Something flickered in Eleanor's expression. Yes. So the direct path is closed. Every direct path is closed. That's why I'm standing on your porch in November instead of in Denver where I have a life. Her voice held no self-pity, just the flat accounting of facts. I'm telling you this because you already know enough to make a guess, and a wrong guess is more dangerous to both of us than the truth. I appreciate that. I'm not telling you for your benefit, she said. I'm telling you because I am not a person who allows other people to be put in danger through ignorance when I can prevent it. Caleb studied her. She met his eyes without blinking. This was a woman who had spent 7 years in a room where the most powerful man in Colorado made decisions. And she had watched and documented and said nothing for 7 years. And now she was here, and she was done being quiet. Not because the fear was gone. He could see the fear if he looked. She had just made the decision that the fear was no longer the most important thing in the room. "Go inside," he said. "Get warm. I need to ride into Redstone and check something." "What are you checking?" "Whether anyone came through town in the last few days asking about a woman traveling alone." The color left Eleanor's face so fast it was like watching a candle go out. "You think he's already—" "I don't think anything yet. That's why I'm going to check." Caleb stepped up onto the porch past her, then stopped with his hand on the door. "The strongbox offer stands. Combination is 11422. You remember numbers." He went inside for his coat and hat, and was saddled and riding inside 6 minutes. The town of Redstone Crossing at 10 in the morning was quiet, in the way of small places in winter, a handful of horses at the rail outside the saloon, smoke from the blacksmith's chimney. Dorothy Payne sweeping the boardwalk in front of her general store, with the expression of a woman doing battle with the entire concept of dirt. Dorothy was 60 years old, had run the store alone for 11 years, since her husband took a fever and left her with an inventory, a deed, and $400 of debt that she'd paid off in 3. She knew everything that moved through Redstone Crossing. She kept that knowledge in her head, the way some women kept recipes organized and accessible, and shared only when she judged it warranted. Caleb tied his horse and walked over. "Morning, Dorothy." "Caleb?" She didn't stop sweeping. "That mail order situation of yours arrived yesterday." "It did." She looked tired. Dorothy made it sound like a character assessment. "The good kind of tired. The kind that comes from having been doing something hard, not from having let hard things happen to you. You notice everything." "I notice what matters." She finally stopped sweeping and looked at him directly. "Man came through 2 days ago on horseback, asking questions." Caleb's expression didn't change. "What kind of questions?" "About women traveling alone. Whether I'd seen any in the last few weeks, whether anyone knew was expected. Said he was a land surveyor working up the valley." Dorothy's voice was dry as creek bed in August. "Except he asked about women specifically and not once about land." "He leave a name?" "James Hooper, which I wrote down because it had the feel of a name someone invented." She looked at Caleb steadily. "He was polite enough, well-dressed, the kind of polite that's a tool and not a quality." "Did you tell him anything?" "I told him I minded my store and he might consider minding his survey." Dorothy picked her broom back up. "He rode out south, toward Billings, I'd reckon. Which means either he's reporting back or he's waiting. Or both." "Or both," she agreed. "Caleb." Her voice dropped half a register. "That woman you brought out to your ranch. She in real trouble or the kind people walk away from?" Caleb looked down the empty main street of Redstone Crossing at the 30 buildings and the church and the 200 people who lived in and around this valley. "The real kind," he said. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. "Well," she said, and the single word carried a weight of things decided in it. "I suppose you'd better handle it then. Working on it. You need anything from the store, you come to the back." She started sweeping again. "And tell your woman Dorothy Payne says hello and to rest if she can." Caleb rode back to the ranch faster than he'd ridden out. The sky had gone from gray to the particular low white that meant snow before nightfall, and the cold was the kind that got into the spaces between things. Eleanor was at the kitchen table when he came in. She had the leather bag open in front of her and was going through pages with the focused attention of someone taking inventory of a weapon before a fight. She looked up when the door opened, and he saw the question in her face before she asked it. "Someone was here 2 days ago," he said, riding through asking questions. "He's gone for now." "For now," she repeated. "He didn't get anything. Dorothy Payne runs the general store. She's not one to give information to people with bad manners and worse cover stories. Caleb hung his coat on the door hook and came to the table. But it means Vance knows roughly where you are. He may not have the specific location yet. He will. Eleanor looked back down at the papers in front of her. Her hands were still. Perfectly still, which he'd already learned was not her natural state, but what she did when she was controlling something. How long do you think I have? Days, maybe less. Then I need to think differently about the timeline. She touched the edge of one ledger page, not reading it, just touching it. I was going to take time to find a lawyer, someone I could trust, someone outside of Vance's influence. Where were you planning to look? I have a name, a federal circuit judge who handled a case against a Colorado land speculator 2 years ago. He found against the speculator even though the man had political connections. His name is Arthur Breck. He's based in Helena. Caleb looked at her. Judge Breck, you've done your research. I've had 7 years to learn how Harrison Vance operates, she said. I spent the last 8 months of my employment doing nothing but watching and preparing before I took the ledgers. I didn't run blindly. I chose when to run and what to take and where to go. She looked up at him and something complicated moved through her expression. I am not, she said carefully, a woman who waits to be rescued. I want to make that plain before we go any further. I didn't think you were. Most men. She stopped. I'm not most men. He said it simply without pride in it. And for what it's worth, I didn't place that advertisement looking for someone to manage. I've got Tom and Curtis and Pete for that. I placed it because... He stopped himself. That's beside the point. What is the point? He sat down across from her. The point is that you came here with something that can put a criminal away and protect 60 families that he's been stealing from for the better part of a decade. The point is that the man's already got someone in the territory looking for you, and the clock is running. And the point is that you came to my ranch, which means whether you intended it or not, this is now my problem too. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. That's either very generous, she said, or very foolish. Probably both. She almost smiled. Not quite, but close enough that he counted it. She looked down at the ledgers again, and this time when she touched the pages, it was different, not controlling, but something more like resolve. All right, Mr. Hargrove, she said quietly. Then we'd better figure out how to get these to Helena before his men figure out exactly where I am. Outside, the first snow of November began to fall on Redstone Crossing, soft and steady and indifferent to what was coming. And upstairs in the room with the lock, she trusted Eleanor Marsh had left something on the windowsill that Caleb hadn't noticed when he came in. A folded piece of paper with a name on it. Not a note for him, something older. A letter worn at the fold lines from being opened and reread too many times. He didn't read it, but he saw the name on the outside in handwriting that wasn't Eleanor's. Her father's, he'd guess from the age of the paper. A man who had taught his daughter to count and to read and to think for herself, and then left her alone in a world that punished women for all three. The snow fell harder. The stove ticked and breathed. And in the kitchen, Eleanor Marsh turned the next page of the ledger and kept working, because some women, when they finally stopped running, did not rest. They prepared. The snow that started Tuesday night laid 2 inches on the ground by Wednesday morning, and was still coming down when Eleanor appeared at the top of the stairs before dawn, with the leather bag on its cord, and her hair already pinned. Caleb was at the stove. He handed her coffee without comment. She took it and stood at the kitchen window, watching the white dark outside, and he could see her mind was already 3 steps ahead of wherever her body was standing. I need to send a letter to Helena, she said, to Judge Breck, before anyone in this territory knows I'm here. Dorothy Payne handles outgoing post at the general store. The same Dorothy Payne who told you about the man asking questions. The same. Eleanor turned from the window. Can she be trusted with something sensitive? She kept my business private for 11 years without being asked. I'd say that qualifies. Eleanor considered this with the same focused attention she gave everything. "I'll write it this morning. I need you to tell me what to leave out so it doesn't flag if someone intercepts it before it reaches Helena. Don't use Vance's name. Don't use your name. Reference the documents as business records related to a property dispute you're handling on behalf of a client. Address it to Breck's clerk, not to Breck himself. Clerks are less watched." Caleb set down his cup. "You learned that from your investigative work. From 7 years of watching a man control information." She said it flatly. Vance never put anything sensitive in writing under his own hand. He dictated to intermediaries. Made sure there was always someone between himself and any written record that could be used against him. A pause. Except in the internal ledgers. He trusted those because he trusted the room they were kept in. But not the person in the room. Eleanor looked at him steadily. He didn't think the person in the room was paying that kind of attention. His mistake. Yes. Pete came downstairs at 6:30 and made biscuits in a pointed silence that communicated he'd noticed the conversation was serious and had decided his biscuits were more important than whatever it was. Tom Birch came in from checking the horses and poured coffee and sat down and looked at the snow through the window and said nothing at all, which was Tom's version of participating. Curtis Wade came in last, stomped snow off his boots with more energy than the task required, saw Eleanor at the table with papers spread in front of her, and said, "Morning, miss. You need anything?" "Ink," Eleanor said, "if there's any." Curtis produced a bottle from the desk in the corner with the pride of a man who has been useful. Eleanor thanked him in a way that made Curtis stand slightly straighter for the rest of the morning. She wrote the letter in 20 minutes. Caleb read it once. It was precise and opaque and would read like routine legal correspondence to anyone who didn't know what they were looking for. He told her so. "I've had practice writing things that say 2 different things depending on who reads them," she said. "Vance made you do that. Vance required it. I learned it." She folded the letter with exact creases. There's a difference between what a man makes you do and what you take from the experience. Caleb looked at her. "That's true. I know it's true." She held the folded letter and didn't say anything else for a moment. "My father used to say that knowledge is the one thing they can't take back once they've given it to you, even if they gave it to you by accident." Something shifted in her face and was gone just as fast. He was a school teacher. He thought every bad situation had an education in it somewhere if you looked hard enough. He sounds like a smart man. He was. Her voice didn't invite more questions on the subject, and Caleb didn't ask any. He rode into Redstone before 8 with the letter inside his coat. Dorothy was already moving boxes of dry goods from the back with the efficiency of a woman who'd decided winter was not an excuse for disorder. She took the letter, looked at the address, looked at Caleb, and put it in the outgoing pouch without a word. Then she said, "That Hooper man came back through this morning?" Caleb went still. "How early?" "Before I opened. Bert called her at the livery, saw him. Said he rode in from the south. Asked Bert if any wagons had come through from the north in the last 2 days, then rode out again toward the creek road." Dorothy's voice was level. "The creek road goes north toward your valley, Caleb." "I know where it goes." "Then you know what I'm telling you." She looked at him with the direct patience of a woman who had raised 4 children and buried a husband and was not going to waste words. "Whatever that woman is carrying, it's put you in the middle of something that's moving faster than you thought." "Yes?" "You need help." "Working on it." Dorothy put both hands flat on the counter. "Marshall Purcell is useless, and we both know it, but Reverend Cullum knows every family in this valley, and half of them owe him favors that aren't the spiritual kind. And Henry Aldrich at the land office has been fighting with the territorial judiciary for 2 years over a deed dispute that smells like the same kind of financial manipulation your woman is describing." She paused. "I'm not telling you what to do." "You are a little." "I'm giving you information," Dorothy said. "What you do with it is your own affair." She picked up her box of dry goods. "Tell her to rest when she can. Tired women make decisions they wouldn't otherwise make. Caleb rode back to the ranch at a pace that the weather didn't really warrant. The snow had stopped, but the sky was the kind of flat white that promised more before evening. He came in the back door and found Eleanor standing in the front room, with her arms crossed and her head tilted listening. "There's a rider on the South Ridge," she said without turning around. "He's been there for 10 minutes, not moving." Caleb went to the window. She was right, a dark shape against the white tree-lined stationery watching the ranch yard. "How did you—" "The horses in the corral changed their behavior. They do that when there's something on the high ground watching them." She finally turned. "Is that him? The man from town?" "Likely. What does he want?" "Right now, just to confirm you're here." Caleb stepped back from the window. "He won't move yet. He'll ride back and send word. Then whoever Vance sends next will be more than one man with a cover story." Eleanor's jaw tightened, but her voice stayed even. "How long?" "If he rides back to Billings today, sends a telegram, and Vance responds with men already positioned in the territory 3 days, maybe 4. He watched her. "If Vance himself decides to come." "Vance doesn't come personally to things like this," Eleanor said. "He sends people. He stays clean." Something hardened in her expression. "That's part of how he's operated for so long. He's never the man in the room when the bad thing happens. He's always somewhere else with witnesses." "Then whoever he sends will have legal papers, probably a warrant for your arrest on the theft charges he prepared." "Yes. Which means when they arrive, the law will technically be on their side." "Yes." Eleanor uncrossed her arms and looked at the ledger bag where it sat on the table. "Unless we move first." "Tell me what you're thinking." She picked up the bag and set it on the table and opened it. Inside were 7 ledger books, each one dense with columns of figures in Eleanor's tight, precise handwriting, and beneath them a sheaf of original receipts and contracts, some with Harrison Vance's signature on them. She spread 3 of the ledgers open side by side. "This is 18 months of falsified freight contracts. These names—" She pointed to a column. "These are ranchers in southern Colorado and northern New Mexico who paid Vance for freight services that were either never delivered or delivered short. The difference between what they paid and what was recorded in the public accounts runs to just over $40,000 for this period alone." Caleb looked at the columns. He'd spent 3 years reading financial records for other people's trouble. He knew what he was looking at. And the other ledgers. Different schemes. Inflated insurance claims on freight damage, kickbacks from suppliers recorded under fictitious vendor names, and— She turned to the last book thicker than the others. Payments to 3 officials in the Territorial Land Office, recorded as consulting fees. I cross-referenced these with disputed land claims filed in the same period. In every case, the disputed claim was resolved in favor of a party connected to Vance's business interests. She looked up. "That's where your name came up." Caleb stopped. "Say that again." "Hargrove Ranch, it's in here." She turned the ledger to face him and pointed to a line entry from 14 months ago. A payment of $800 to someone listed only as TW at the Cascade County Land Office. 14 months ago, what was the status of your eastern boundary claim? Caleb stared at the line. The eastern boundary claim. He'd filed for an extension of grazing rights along the creek bed 14 months ago and been denied on the grounds of a competing claim from a freight depot development that had never materialized. He'd lost 600 acres of winter grazing land and spent 4 months trying to understand why. "TW," he said. "Thomas Wendell. He was the deputy registrar at the Cascade County office." "He left the position 8 months ago," Eleanor said. "According to this, he received payments from Vance's operation at least 4 times over a 2-year period." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved through the bare willows along the creek. Caleb stood looking at a line of numbers that explained something that had cost him half a winter's forage and a season of short grazing, and the cold feeling that moved through him was not anger exactly, but the particular clarity that comes when a thing that was confused becomes suddenly irrevocably plain. "He stole my land claim," Caleb said. "He purchased a favorable outcome," Eleanor said. "There's a difference in terms of how it can be prosecuted." She held his gaze. "I didn't know that entry was there when I came here. I chose your advertisement because you were remote, and the description suggested someone self-sufficient who wouldn't ask too many questions." A pause. "I was somewhat wrong about the last part." "Somewhat. But I'm telling you now because you have standing." Her voice was precise and deliberate. "You are not just a man who took in a woman with documents. You are a victim of this scheme with documented evidence of the specific transaction that harmed you. That changes your legal position entirely. You can file a complaint independently of me. You can be a plaintiff, not just a witness." Caleb looked at her. "You figured this out this morning?" "I've been through every entry in these books 3 times in the past 3 weeks. I knew your entry was there. I was deciding whether to tell you." "What made you decide?" Eleanor closed the ledger. "Because you rode into town this morning to protect me, instead of to protect yourself, and I decided that kind of person deserves to know the full picture." Tom Birch appeared in the doorway from the back hall, moving quietly the way he always did, and from his expression it was clear he'd been standing there long enough to have heard most of it. He was 41 years old and had worked on the Hargrove Ranch for 6 years, and had a way of looking at a situation that reminded Caleb of a man reading weather. "That rider on the ridge is gone," Tom said. "Good," Caleb said. "Road east, not south." Tom came into the kitchen and poured himself coffee with the unhurried motion of a man taking his time to say something. "East goes to the Billings telegraph office faster than south does. 2 hours faster." Eleanor looked at Caleb. "That shortens your timeline." Tom continued conversationally, looking at neither of them specifically. "If he sends a telegram from the Billings office this afternoon, response could come back same day. Men already positioned in Billings could ride out tomorrow morning." "Tom," Caleb said, "I'm just talking through geography." Tom sat down with his coffee. "I've got no stake in whatever the situation is." He looked at Eleanor directly. "Except that I've worked on this ranch 6 years, and the boundary claim Caleb lost 14 months ago cost us a hard winter, and cost me wages when we had to sell stock early. So I've got some interest in the general subject." Eleanor studied him with the focused attention she gave everything. "What are you saying, Mr. Birch?" "I'm saying that if someone was going to take documents to Helena before a man with money and warrants arrives in this valley tomorrow morning, is probably better than waiting to find out how fast the response comes." He drank his coffee. "I know the mountain road. Faster than the valley road and harder to follow. I've taken cattle up it in March. November's not worse." "Tom," Caleb started. "I'm not asking permission," Tom said mildly. "I'm letting you know I'm available." Caleb looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at the ledger books spread on the table. All 7 of them, 412 pages of Harrison Vance's careful record of other people's losses. She looked at them the way she'd been looking at them for 3 weeks, with the combination of exhaustion and absolute refusal that had kept her moving when exhaustion alone should have stopped her. "I can't ask you to do that," she said to Tom. "You didn't ask," Tom said. "I offered." "Why would you?" "Because Caleb took me on when nobody else would after the trouble in Butte," Tom said simply. "And I don't forget things like that." He put down his cup. "I'll get the horses ready for first light. We take 2. You carry the documents. I carry the contingency." "Contingency," Eleanor repeated. Tom reached back and pulled aside his coat to show the rifle slung across his back that she apparently hadn't noticed. "Contingency." Eleanor looked at Caleb. Something moved through her expression that was harder to name than fear or relief. It was the specific look of a person who has been carrying something alone for a very long time and has just been told by someone with no obligation to say it that they do not have to carry it alone anymore. "All right," she said quietly. "Good." Tom stood. "I'm going to go tell Pete he's cooking for fewer people tomorrow and listen to him complain about it." He walked out with the same unhurried pace he'd walked in. Eleanor stood looking at the table for a moment after he left. Then she sat down and began carefully, methodically reordering the ledger pages, checking each entry against the next, making a list in her own handwriting of the strongest evidence entries with their page numbers and corresponding dates, the same focused preparation she'd been doing since before Caleb met her, because Eleanor Marsh did not wait for things to happen to her. She prepared for what was coming, and then she walked toward it. Caleb sat across from her and watched her work and thought about a man on the East Road riding toward a telegraph office with news of her location, and about 3 days that might be 2, and about 7 ledger books that could end a decade of theft if they reached the right hands. He thought about Thomas Wendell and $800 and 600 acres of winter grazing. He thought about Eleanor's father and what he'd taught her, and how that teaching had survived everything that had been done since to make her doubt it. "You should eat something," he said. "I know." She didn't look up from the page. "I will in a minute." "You said that at breakfast." She paused, looked up. Something softened slightly in her expression. "I said I'd eat in a minute at breakfast." "You said you'd be down in a minute. That was 3 hours ago." Eleanor looked at the window, at the white sky, and the snow on the ground, and the empty south ridge where the rider had been. Then she closed the ledger with a quiet, deliberate sound and said, "All right, Mr. Hargrove, feed me, and then we plan." They left before first light with 2 horses and a sky the color of iron. Eleanor had slept 4 hours, which Caleb knew because he'd heard the lamp in her room stay lit until well past midnight, and then the house go quiet, and when he knocked on her door at 4:30, she answered immediately in a voice that was already fully awake. She came downstairs with the leather bag on its cord and a second coat she'd borrowed from the hook by the back door, without asking which he took as a sign she was thinking practically, and not about manners, which was the right priority. Tom had the horses ready in the dark yard. He handed Eleanor the reins of the gray without ceremony, and she took them and checked the saddle cinch herself before mounting, which made Tom look at Caleb with an expression that said he approved. Pete stood in the doorway, in his long underwear, with a cloth bundle that turned out to be biscuits and dried beef wrapped in a kitchen towel. He thrust it at Eleanor without looking at her directly. "You don't eat enough," he said. "It's a medical fact that people who don't eat enough make bad decisions." "Thank you, Pete," Eleanor said. "Don't thank me. Just eat the biscuits." He went back inside and shut the door, and through the kitchen window, Caleb could see him standing at the stove with his back to them, which was Pete's way of being emotional about something without admitting it. Curtis Wade came out of the bunkhouse as they were moving out and stood in the yard watching them go. He was 24 years old and didn't fully understand the situation, but understood enough to know it was serious, and he watched them ride out with the particular expression of a young man who wishes he were going instead of staying. The mountain road Tom knew climbed north of the valley and cut east through a pass before dropping down toward the Helena Road. It was not a road in any formal sense. It was a track made by decades of cattle drives and enough use that it was distinguishable from the surrounding terrain. If you knew what you were looking at, which Tom did, and Eleanor clearly didn't, though she didn't ask questions, and kept her horse close behind Tom's without being told. They rode for 2 hours in silence, broken only by the sound of hooves on frozen ground and the occasional wind coming down off the high country. When the sky lightened enough to see properly, Eleanor pulled up alongside Caleb on a stretch of flat ground and said, "Tell me about Judge Breck. What do you want to know?" "You said his name like you recognized it. You know more than what I told you." Caleb considered. "I know he handled the Crestwood land fraud case 3 years ago. Crestwood had 3 county commissioners in his pocket and a state senator who'd received what got called a consulting payment in the press. Breck convicted all of them, took 14 months and 3 attempts to dismiss the case before it was over. He doesn't let go." "He does not." "Is he honest?" "As far as anyone can tell from the outside, yes. He's not wealthy. Never has been. Men who take money find ways to become wealthy. Breck lives in a house that his father built and drives the same wagon he drove 10 years ago. Caleb glanced at her. That's not proof, but it's a pattern. Eleanor nodded, processing this the way she processed everything quietly and thoroughly. When we get to Helena, I need to speak to him directly. Not through a clerk, not through an intermediary. Directly. The letter I sent will get me in the door, but I need to be in the room when he reads these ledgers, because there are entries that require explanation to understand their significance. He may not see you immediately. Then I'll wait. She said it simply, like waiting was a neutral fact and not a risk. I've waited 7 years for the right moment. I can wait 2 more days. Tom, who had been riding slightly ahead and apparently listening to all of it, said without turning around, "There's a boarding house on the south end of Helena, run by a woman named May Clifford. She's particular about who she takes in, but she doesn't talk to strangers about her guests. I've stayed there twice coming through with cattle." "You know a great many useful people," Eleanor said. "I've had reason to move through the territory quietly a few times." Tom left it at that, and so did Eleanor. They stopped at mid-morning to rest the horses on a flat stretch below the tree line where a frozen creek offered water if you broke the surface ice with a boot heel. Eleanor ate 2 of Pete's biscuits, standing up, and looked out over the valley they'd climbed above, while Caleb watered the horses. From this height, the Hargrove Ranch was visible as a small cluster of dark shapes against the white ground and the creek line smoke coming from the kitchen chimney, everything looking ordinary and still. "Curtis and Pete," Eleanor said. "If men come while we're gone." "They'll be fine," Caleb said. "Anyone coming for you won't waste time on the ranch hands when they find out you're not there." "Unless they're making a point." Caleb looked at her. "Vance makes his points through legal process. That's his method. Rough men riding in to threaten ranch hands draws attention he doesn't want. He burned—" Eleanor stopped, then said, "He had a man beaten in Denver 2 years ago, a shipping clerk who'd talked to a competitor about contract terms. The man spent a month in bed." Her voice was flat the way it went when she was recounting things she'd seen. "It was handled through intermediaries. Vance was at a dinner party at the time with 12 witnesses." "Did the clerk report it?" "No." A pause. "He had a family." Caleb said nothing for a moment. Then, "Curtis and Pete know to ride into Redstone if anything feels wrong. Dorothy Payne will get word to the marshal and to Reverend Cullum and to every rancher in the valley inside of 2 hours. Vance's men won't want that kind of noise." Eleanor looked at him. "You've been thinking about contingencies since yesterday." "Since yesterday morning. Since you came back from town and I told you about the man on the ridge." "Before that," he said. "Since you stepped off the coach with your hand wrapped and that bag that you wouldn't let go of. I started thinking about contingencies then." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. The wind moved her hair loose from one pin, and she pushed it back with the automatic gesture of a woman used to doing it. "Most people," she said slowly, "when they saw that. When they saw the bag in the hand, they looked away." "I know. In Denver. The other clerks in the office. The women in my boarding house. They saw things and they looked away because looking meant being involved, and being involved meant being a target." She wasn't accusing anyone. She was just stating what she'd observed with the same precision she brought to ledger columns. "It's a rational response." "It is," Caleb agreed. "So why didn't you?" He thought about it honestly. "Because I spent 3 years finding out what happened when people looked away. I did it professionally. I went in afterward and counted the cost and wrote it in a report and gave the report to the person who hired me and went home. And one day I gave a report to a man whose daughter had died while I was writing the previous report, and I decided I was done looking away for money." He picked up his horse's reins. "That's the honest answer." Eleanor looked at him for a long time. Long enough that Tom, who had moved a diplomatic distance away to check his saddle, glanced over once, and then became very interested in his saddle again. Your former employer, Eleanor said. The investigation work. Why did you leave it? I just told you. You told me the last reason. What were the other ones? Caleb looked at her steady gray eyes and thought that 7 years working for a man like Vance had taught Eleanor Marsh to read the difference between a partial answer and a complete one. I was good at finding things out, he said. I was less good at what came after, what you did with the information, how you lived with what you knew. He paused. Some men are built for carrying that kind of weight indefinitely. I found out I wasn't one of them. And ranching. Ranching is honest. You put work in, you get a clear result. The land doesn't lie to you. A corner of his mouth moved. It'll kill you without hesitation, but it won't lie. Eleanor looked at the white valley below them and the smoke from his kitchen chimney and said, I think I understand that. They rode on. The trouble found them 2 hours later on the eastern descent, where the mountain road narrowed between two rock faces before opening into the lower country. Tom came to a stop so abrupt that Eleanor nearly rode into him, and when Caleb pulled up, he saw immediately what Tom had seen. 3 riders on the road below. Stationary. Watching the road above them. They came up the valley road, Tom said quietly. Faster than I calculated. Caleb looked at the 3 men. They were too far to see faces, but the posture was clear enough. These were not ranchers checking fence line. They were positioned across the road the way men position themselves when they are waiting for something specific to come down. Eleanor's hand went to the leather bag at her chest. Not grabbing it, just touching it the way a person touches something they need to know is still there. How many ways off this road? Caleb said to Tom. 1. There's a cut to the north about a quarter-mile back. Comes out lower but adds 2 hours. They may have it covered. Maybe. But if they do, it's 1 man at most. This is their main position. Caleb looked at Eleanor. Her face was composed in that particular way. She had the stillness that was not calm, but control. That's far enough that they haven't confirmed it's us, he said. We go back to the cut before they decide to move up. And if they follow, then we deal with that on ground we choose. Eleanor turned her horse without arguing, which told him she trusted his read of the situation. And something about that simple, wordless trust sat differently than he expected. They moved back up the road at a pace that was fast without being panicked, because panicked horses on mountain road in November was its own kind of danger. Tom found the cut barely visible between 2 stands of pine and took them down it at a controlled descent that required full attention and left no room for conversation. Eleanor handled her horse with the competence of someone who'd learned young and hadn't lost it, and Caleb filed that away with the other things he was learning about her. The cut came out on a narrow shelf of land that ran north and then dropped into a creek drainage heading east, adding distance but keeping them off the main road. Tom set a pace that was sustainable for the horses and kept his eyes ahead and said after 20 minutes of this, there were 4, not 3. You saw 4. Third man was in the trees above the road, watching the high approach. When the 2 on the road looked up at us, he didn't move, which means he was watching for movement from above, trained positioning. Vance sent experienced men, Eleanor said. Or whoever Vance sent hired experienced men locally. Tom glanced back. There's a difference. Local men know this territory. Men brought in from outside know tradecraft, but not the ground. Which is better for us, Caleb said. Depends on which they sent. Tom looked forward again. We'll know when we see how they handle the road split at the creek bottom. Local man goes right without thinking. Outside man stops and looks at both options. They reached the creek bottom 40 minutes later, and Tom pulled up in the shadow of a rock overhang, and they waited. 3 minutes. 5. Then the sound of hooves on the road above moving fast, and then slowing at the fork. A pause. Then the sound of horses moving right without hesitation. Local men, Tom said quietly. Or at least 1 local with them calling the direction. Eleanor let out a breath that she'd been holding so carefully Caleb hadn't known she was holding it. They know this territory. That's worse. It means they know the Helena Road. Tom sat thinking for a moment. But it also means I know who they might be. There are 3 men in this county who hire out for this kind of work, and I know all their patterns. He looked at Caleb. Ray Dugan and his brother work out of a place near Garrison. They know the south routes, but not the north cross. Dugan's men always go right at a fork, because Ray has a habit of going to the near option first and doubling back. You know Ray Dugan, Caleb said. I know enough about him to know he's thorough, but not imaginative. He'll work the obvious route to Helena, confirm we're not on it, and then come back to recheck the alternates. Tom gauged the sky. That gives us a window. How wide? 3 hours if we move now. Then we move now, Eleanor said. She'd been listening to this exchange with complete attention, and she didn't wait for Caleb to confirm or redirect. She just nudged her horse forward and looked at Tom and said, "Lead." Tom led. The next 2 hours were the hardest riding of the journey, not because of the terrain, but because of the sustained attention it required. Every sound from behind that might be hoofbeats, every movement in the peripheral trees, every place the road bent that might show riders waiting on the other side of the bend. Eleanor rode without complaint, and without the kind of constant checking behind that would have told Caleb her nerve was failing. She looked forward and rode and trusted Tom's judgment on the route, which again was not the response of a woman in unmanaged fear. It was the response of a woman who had assessed the situation and made a decision, and was executing it. It was on the last stretch before the Helena Road proper that Caleb pulled up alongside her and said, "When we get to town, what's the first thing you do?" "Find May Clifford's boarding house. Get the documents secure." She thought for a moment. "Send a note to Judge Breck's clerk that I'm in town and need an urgent appointment. Reference the letter I sent ahead." "And if Breck can't see you today?" "Then I wait in a room with a locked door and I review the highest priority evidence and I organize my case so that when he does see me, I can give him everything he needs in the first 20 minutes. She looked at Caleb sideways. "A man who doesn't let go of a case but has a full docket will give me 20 minutes before he decides whether to give me more. I need those 20 minutes to count." "They will." "You've never seen me present a case?" "No, but I've seen how you organize information and how you handle unexpected pressure and how you talk when you're not guarding your words." He kept his eyes on the road ahead. 20 minutes will be enough." Eleanor didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice was quieter than usual. "You have a way of saying things like that." "What kind of things?" "Certain things. Like you've thought about them and decided they're true before you say them out loud." "That's generally how I try to operate. Most people say things first and decide if they're true afterward." She paused. "Harrison Vance especially. He said whatever was useful and truth was a secondary consideration if it came into play at all." "I know men like that. I spent 7 years working for one." Her voice was flat again, the way it went when she was looking at a hard thing directly. "It changes how you hear words. You start parsing everything for the gap between what's said and what's meant. You start assuming the gap exists, even when it doesn't." "Does it exist when I talk to you?" She looked at him. The Helena Road was visible ahead now where Tom had stopped to wait for them, and the sky had gone from white to the pale gold of late afternoon, and Eleanor Marsh looked at Caleb Hargrove with those gray eyes that missed nothing and said, "No, that's what I'm still getting used to." Tom was watching the road junction with his hand resting on his rifle when they came up. "Clean," he said. "No one's beaten us here." "Then we go," Caleb said. "We go?" Eleanor agreed and touched her heels to the gray horse and moved out onto the Helena Road, carrying 7 ledger books and 412 pages of other people's stolen futures toward a judge who didn't let go of cases in a town where nobody knew yet what was coming. Behind them, somewhere on the mountain roads of Cascade County, Ray Dugan's men were working the wrong route. They wouldn't stay wrong forever, but for now, 3 hours ahead was enough. May Clifford's boarding house was on the south end of Helena, exactly where Tom said it would be, a 2-story frame building set back from the street, with clean curtains in the windows and a small sign that said simply "Rooms," which May apparently considered sufficient advertisement for anyone worth having as a guest. May herself was 62, broad-shouldered, and had the eyes of a woman who had heard every story a person could tell, and retained the right to believe none of them until proven otherwise. She looked at Tom when they came to the door, then at Caleb, then at Eleanor, and her assessment of Eleanor took approximately 4 seconds, before something in her expression settled into decision. "Tom Birch," she said. "Last time you came through, you left a good saddle blanket in the second room." "I wondered where that went," Tom said. "I kept it." May stepped back from the door. "Come in out of the cold." Inside was warm and smelled of wood smoke and something cooking. May led them to a back sitting room and closed the door and looked at Eleanor with the direct attention of a woman who did not have time for circumlocution. "What kind of trouble?" Eleanor set the leather bag on the table. "The financial kind. I have documents that implicate a wealthy man in Denver in a fraud operation spanning 5 years and 3 territories. I need 2 days, possibly 3. Men looking for you?" "Yes. 4 that we know of. Local hires, we believe." May looked at the bag, then at Eleanor's wrapped hand, which had bled through its cloth again on the ride down. "That hand needs proper attention. After I get these secured." "Before," May said, and her voice left no room for argument that would be productive. "The documents will be in the same condition in 10 minutes that they're in now. Your hand may not be." Eleanor looked at her for a moment, then at Caleb, then said, "All right." May took Eleanor to the kitchen, and Caleb heard the sound of water being heated, and Eleanor's voice answering questions in the clipped, factual way she answered everything. He sat in the back room with Tom and looked at the leather bag on the table, and thought about 4 riders, somewhere between the mountain road and Helena, who would not stay on the wrong route indefinitely. "She'll need to see Breck tomorrow morning," Tom said. "First thing." "I know. Tonight we need to know whether Dugan's men have contacts in Helena. If they do, they may already have someone watching the approaches to the court building. You know anyone in Helena who'd have that information?" Tom thought about it. "There's a man named Frank Selby who runs freight dispatch out of the North Yard. He knows every hired outfit operating in the territory, who's working for whom, who's got standing contracts with which interests. Frank and I have done business." He stood. "I'll go tonight. You stay with her." Caleb looked at him. "Tom." "I'll be careful." Tom picked up his hat. "I'm less notable than you are, and Frank talks more easily to someone coming in like a passing acquaintance than to someone with obvious business." He paused at the door. "She's going to be all right, Caleb. She's the most organized person I've met in 20 years of knowing complicated people." After Tom left, May came back and sat down across from Caleb with 2 cups of coffee and the manner of a woman who had decided he merited a direct conversation. "Her hand will heal. Nothing permanent, though she should have seen to it a week ago." May wrapped both hands around her cup. "She told me some of what she's carrying." "She trusts quickly for someone who's been through what she's been through," Caleb said. "No, she doesn't." May looked at him steadily. "She assessed me in 4 seconds and decided I was trustworthy on the available evidence. That's not trusting quickly. That's reading people accurately." She paused. "She reads you the same way, you know. I could see it when she looked at you in the doorway. She's been reading you since she got here, and she's decided something." "What did she decide?" "That's not my information to give." May stood. "She'll be down in a few minutes. I told her to rest, but she won't. She'll want to organize those papers before anything else." She picked up her cup. "You're a careful man, Mr. Hargrove. Try not to be too careful. Some moments don't wait for a man to decide he's ready." Eleanor came downstairs 20 minutes later with her hand properly bandaged and her hair redone and the leather bag across her chest where it always was. She sat down at the table and opened the bag and began laying out the ledger books in the order she'd established, which Caleb now recognized as chronological within each scheme rather than by year overall. She'd built a logical architecture for presenting this information, and she moved through it the way a person moves through a space they know by heart. "Breck's office opens at 8, Caleb said. "I'll go ahead of you in the morning and speak to the clerk. Give him the context before you arrive so the appointment isn't starting from nothing." Eleanor's hands paused on the ledgers. "You'd do that. It's practical. A man walking in to vouch for the urgency of a meeting gets it scheduled faster than a woman walking in alone with documents. That's an accurate assessment of how it works." Something moved across her face, not bitterness, just the recognition of a fact she'd long since stopped fighting on principle because the principle wasn't worth the time it took to fight when there were results to achieve. "All right, I'll write out the 3 key points I need him to understand before he sees the ledgers. You can give him those." She wrote while Caleb watched, and the fire burned down in the grate, and the house settled into its nighttime quiet around them. She wrote with the same precision she brought to everything, no wasted words, each sentence constructed to carry maximum information in minimum space. She had learned that in 7 years of drafting correspondence for a man who wanted his meaning clear and his culpability invisible, and she had turned the skill against the teacher, and Caleb thought that was one of the more complete forms of justice he'd encountered. When she handed him the paper, she said, "There's something I need to tell you." "Tell me." "In the ledgers, the entry for your boundary claim. There are 2 more entries underneath it that I didn't mention yesterday." She looked at him with that direct gray gaze. "There's a second payment 6 months after the first. Same recipient. Related to an insurance claim on freight that was routed through your grazing land during the period when you still held the claim. Vance's freight operation used your land while the claim was in dispute, damaged the creek bed crossing, and then filed an insurance claim on the damage as if it were their own property loss. They collected on an asset they didn't own, and that they damaged themselves." She paused. "The amount was $1,400. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He remembered the creek bed crossing, the damage he'd found in spring that he'd attributed to the hard winter, the year the creek ran wrong for 3 months, and he'd had to rebuild the approach at his own cost. That was deliberate. The routing was deliberate. Whether Vance knew specifically whose land it was, I can't prove from the ledgers. But the claim was filed and paid, and the record is there." Eleanor kept her eyes on him. "I'm telling you because you should know the full extent of what was done to you before you stand in Judge Breck's office tomorrow and speak to it. A man who knows the whole picture speaks to it differently than a man who knows part of it." "You could have told me this yesterday." "Yes." "Why didn't you?" She took a slow breath. "Because yesterday I was still deciding how much to involve you. You'd already done more than I had any right to ask. Showing you that the damage to your operation was deeper than you knew felt like—" She stopped, started again. "It felt like I was recruiting you, using your injury to bind you to my cause, and I didn't want to do that. But now you're here and Tom's out in Helena at night running down information about men who are hunting us. And you've ridden 2 days and navigated mountain roads and sent a letter for me and kept my business private, and I don't—" Her voice steadied. "I don't want to be the kind of person who withholds information from someone who has earned it, even when the information is uncomfortable." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "Eleanor." It was the first time he'd used her given name without the formality of her surname following it, and she registered it the way she registered everything. A slight adjustment in her posture, attention sharpening. "Whatever your original reason for choosing my advertisement," he said, "you're not using me. I'm here because I chose to be. The ledger entries about my land are not what brought me to Helena. You brought me to Helena because you were on my ranch and you needed to not be alone, and I am not a man who sends people to fight their battles without help." Eleanor looked at the table, then back at him. "You make it very difficult," she said quietly, "to maintain a professional distance." Is that what you've been trying to do? It's what I've been trying to do since Denver. She touched the edge of the nearest ledger with one finger. I've been trying to maintain professional distance from everyone and everything for 3 weeks, so that I wouldn't make decisions based on feeling and would only make decisions based on what was strategically sound. And it's become increasingly apparent that you are strategically sound. A corner of her mouth moved, which makes the professional distance harder to justify. The fire had gone down to coals. From somewhere upstairs, there was the sound of May moving around the ordinary sounds of a house at night. Caleb sat across the table from Eleanor Marsh with her 7 ledger books between them and thought about May's words and about careful men and moments that didn't wait. After this is done, he said, when the documents are with Breck and the case is filed and Vance is facing what he's facing. What do you want? Eleanor looked at him as if the question was one she hadn't given herself permission to think about. What do you mean? I mean, what do you want? Not what do you need to do next. What do you actually want? She was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then she said, I want to not look over my shoulder when I walk into a room. I want to sleep a whole night without waking up. She paused. I want to teach children somewhere, like my father did. I've known that for years, but there was never the right place, or the right... She stopped. The right circumstances, Caleb said. Yes. Redstone Crossing doesn't have a school, he said. I believe I mentioned that. Eleanor looked at him very carefully. You mentioned it in passing. I mentioned it because it's true and because it seemed relevant. Relevant to what? To what comes after. He held her gaze. I'm not saying it to make you feel obligated. I'm saying it because you said you wanted to teach somewhere, and I happen to know a valley in Montana that needs a teacher and has a ranch with a room that was built as a study for whoever wanted to use it for whatever they chose. He paused. That's all I'm saying. Eleanor looked at him for a long time. The coals shifted in the grate. Caleb, she said, and the way she said his name had the same quality as when he'd said hers the first time without reservation. I came to Montana to disappear. I know. I came there so that no one would find me. I know that too. I didn't come there to... She stopped. Something crossed her face that was not professional distance. I didn't intend for any of this. Nor did I, he said. But here we are. Tom came back near midnight. He knocked on the sitting room door in the particular pattern he'd established without discussion, and Caleb let him in, and Eleanor looked up from the ledgers where she'd been working for the last 2 hours, because Eleanor did not stop working simply because the hour was late. Tom sat down and looked at both of them and said, Frank Selby knows Dugan's operation. Dugan has 2 contacts in Helena, a man who runs a livery on the north side, and a clerk at the land office annex. The livery man watches arrivals and reports to Dugan on anyone matching a description that Dugan's been circulating. He paused. The description is accurate. Woman late 20s, gray eyes, traveling with a leather bag she doesn't set down. Eleanor's hand went to the bag at her chest, not grabbing, just touching. The land office clerk is more concerning, Tom continued. His name is Martin Price. He has access to the filing schedule for Judge Breck's court and has been paid at least twice in the past year to delay filings or reroute documents before they reached Breck's desk. Eleanor set down her pen. They have someone inside the court system. Inside the administrative system. Not Breck himself as far as Frank knows, but the clerk handles intake. Tom looked at Caleb. If Eleanor files through normal channels tomorrow morning, Price may intercept it. Then we don't file through normal channels, Eleanor said. Her voice was already ahead of the problem working it. Breck has a personal clerk separate from the administrative intake. His name is Samuel Holt. He's been with Breck for 9 years, and he's specifically kept separate from the main administrative office because Breck had trouble with document handling 3 years ago in the Crestwood case, and restructured his intake process after. She looked at their expressions. "I researched this before I left Denver. Every step of this I researched." "You know how to reach Holt directly," Caleb said. "The letter I sent went to him. If it arrived, he already knows I'm coming and why." She looked at the window. "I need to know if it arrived." "Frank can find out," Tom said. "He has a man who does courier work for the court, handles deliveries between departments. He'd know if a letter came in through the regular post for Holt's office in the last 3 days. Can you reach Frank tonight?" Tom looked at the hour. "If I go now." Eleanor didn't hesitate. "Please." Tom left again. Eleanor looked at Caleb, and for the first time since he'd known her, she looked something other than controlled. Not frightened. Something closer to exposed, the look of a person standing at the edge of something they've been working toward for months, and suddenly understanding that it is real and not theoretical, and the next 12 hours will decide it. "If the letter didn't arrive," she said. "It arrived," Caleb said. "You can't know that." "No, but you sent it through Dorothy Payne, and she has been moving mail reliably through this territory for 11 years, and she knew it was important. So it arrived." Eleanor looked at him. "You do that again." "Do what?" "Say things like you've decided they're true." "Because I have." He leaned forward slightly. "Eleanor, you have spent 7 years building this case and 3 weeks carrying it across 400 miles and 2 days ahead of men who were paid to stop you. You have done every part of this correctly, including the parts that were painful, and the parts that cost you sleep, and the parts where you had to decide to trust people you had no reason to trust yet." His voice was steady and direct. "The letter arrived. Holt knows you're coming. Tomorrow morning, you walk into that office, and you put 7 ledger books on Arthur Breck's desk, and you give him 20 minutes of the most organized presentation he has ever heard. And Harrison Vance's operation ends." Eleanor looked at him with those gray eyes that had read men and documents and intentions for 7 years, and knew the difference between what was said and what was true. "All right," she said quietly. "All right." Tom came back 40 minutes later, and the look on his face when he walked through the door was answer enough before he spoke. The letter had arrived 3 days prior. Samuel Holt had held it, and he had sent a return message to the post office that had not been collected because Eleanor had already left Redstone Crossing. The return message said, "Come at 8. Bring everything. The judge is waiting." Eleanor read it twice. Then she set it down on the table next to the 7 ledger books and sat very still for a moment. Caleb watched her take in the reality of it, the 3 weeks and the mountain road and the wire wrapped around her hands, and the long nights working by lamplight, all of it arriving at this single sentence on a piece of paper. "Come at 8. The judge is waiting." "Go to sleep," Caleb said. "Both of you. I'll take the first watch." Tom nodded and went upstairs without argument. Eleanor stayed seated for another moment, her hand resting flat on the closed cover of the first ledger book. And then she stood and picked up the leather bag and said, "Caleb." "Yeah. Thank you." She said it the way she had said it the first time on his porch, like the words came from somewhere real and not from habit. For all of it. He nodded once. She went upstairs, and Caleb sat alone with the dying fire and the ledger books and the sound of Helena going quiet around him, and thought about a judge who was waiting, and about 12 hours from now, and about a woman who had decided she was done being afraid, and who had somewhere between a mountain road and a borrowed coat and a plate of Pete Dalloway's biscuits become something more to him than a practical arrangement, though he had not said so yet and would not until the work was done. Some things were worth waiting for. He had learned that the hard way, and he intended to remember it. Caleb was at Judge Breck's court building at 7:30, which gave him 30 minutes before Samuel Holt's office opened, and enough time to watch who else was watching the building. He stood across the street with coffee from a nearby establishment and looked at the approaches. The North liveryman Tom had mentioned Frank Selby's information, put him as a heavy-set man who wore a gray coat and had a habit of standing in doorways, was visible half a block up, doing exactly that. Standing in the doorway of a feed store, with the particular stillness of a man performing casual while being neither. He had not seen Caleb yet, or if he had not connected him to anything worth reporting. Caleb drank his coffee and waited, and at 7:55 walked directly to the side entrance of the court building that Tom had identified from Frank's description, the one used by Breck's personal staff, and not by the general public, and knocked twice. Samuel Holt was a thin man of about 50, with ink-stained fingers and the compressed energy of someone who had worked for a demanding man long enough to adopt his standards. He opened the door, looked at Caleb, and said, "You're with Miss Marsh." "Caleb Hargrove. I ranched her here from Cascade County." "She's coming at 8. "She is. I wanted to give you context before she arrived." Caleb stepped inside when Holt moved back to allow it, and in the next 7 minutes gave Holt the 3 points Eleanor had written out the night before, concise and sequenced, and watched Holt's expression move from careful neutrality to something more alert as the scope of what was coming became clear. 62 individual victims, Holt said, that she's documented. There may be more. And she has original ledgers, not copies. 7 books, 412 pages. Holt was quiet for a moment. Judge Breck has been looking at Vance's operation for 14 months. He had suspicion and no evidence. 2 attempts to subpoena Vance's internal records were blocked at the territorial level. He looked at Caleb with the focused attention of a man recalibrating. "Miss Marsh worked inside that operation for 7 years. "Yes. She was there when the records were made." "She made most of them," Caleb said, "under instruction, which she documented as she went." Holt looked at the clock on the wall. 3 minutes to 8. "Bring her in the side door," he said. "Don't use the front. There's a man on the street who has been there since yesterday afternoon, and I know what he's waiting for." Eleanor arrived at 8 o'clock with the leather bag on its cord, and Tom Birch 2 steps behind her. She came through the side door and down the corridor and into Holt's anteroom, and when she saw Caleb standing there, something in her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch, the way they did when she allowed herself one moment of relief before moving to the next task. "He's ready," she said to Holt. "He's been ready since your letter arrived," Holt said, and opened the interior door. Judge Arthur Breck was 60 years old and looked like a man who had spent those 60 years making decisions he intended to stand behind. He was not large, but he had a presence that the room organized itself around, the kind that came not from volume, but from the quality of his attention. He stood when Eleanor entered, which she clearly had not expected, and gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Miss Marsh," he said, "sit down and bring whatever you're carrying." Eleanor sat. She put the leather bag on the desk and opened it and began laying out the ledger books with the same methodical precision she'd used every time Caleb had watched her do it. Breck watched her hands without interrupting, and his expression had the quality of a man who was listening to several things at once. "I'm going to start with the clearest evidence and build outward," Eleanor said. "The pattern requires context to understand fully, but the core fraud is legible in the first book alone. If at any point you want me to stop and explain an entry, tell me." "Go ahead," Breck said. She went ahead. Caleb stood against the wall with Tom and listened to Eleanor Marsh present 7 years of Harrison Vance's crimes in a voice that was steady and precise, and carried underneath its precision the weight of everything it had cost her to be in this room. She did not editorialize. She did not ask for sympathy. She laid out numbers and dates and names and corresponding evidence with the focused clarity of someone who had organized this presentation in her head so many times that it had become as natural as breathing. Breck asked questions, good ones, specific, testing the evidence from different angles. Eleanor answered every one without hesitation, and when an answer required qualification, she said so before giving the qualification, which Caleb noticed made Breck trust her more rather than less. 20 minutes became 40. 40 became an hour and a half. When it was over, Breck sat back in his chair and looked at the ledger books spread across his desk, all 7 of them open to the pages Eleanor had marked, and was quiet for a long time. "Miss Marsh," he finally said, "are you aware that what you've presented here constitutes not only civil fraud, but criminal conspiracy under territorial statute, and that 2 of the officials named in these records hold current appointments under the territorial governor?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "Are you aware that bringing this to prosecution will require you to testify, in open court, against a man with significant resources who will direct those resources toward discrediting you?" "Yes." "And you intend to do that?" Eleanor looked at him directly. "I have been intending to do that for 14 months, Your Honor. Since the day I understood fully what I was looking at, and began making copies before I took the originals." She paused. "I did not come this far to stop at the courthouse door." Breck looked at her for a moment longer. Then he turned to Holt, who had been standing quietly near the door. "Samuel, get me a federal telegraph. I need to reach the district attorney in Denver before noon." He stood. "And find Marshal Greer. I want him in this office within the hour." He looked back at Eleanor. "You'll need to remain in Helena while I review these documents in full and prepare the initial filing. That will take 2 days at minimum." "I understand. Is there somewhere secure you're staying?" "May Clifford's boarding house," Caleb said from the wall. Breck glanced at him as if slightly surprised he was still there. "South end of town. May's been keeping confidences in this territory for 30 years. "I know May," Breck said, and something briefly human crossed his judicial expression. "Tell her I said hello." He looked at Eleanor again. "Miss Marsh, what you've done here required considerable courage." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "What it required," she said carefully, "was the right people being willing to help. I had the knowledge. Other people made it possible to use it." She did not look at Caleb when she said it, but he felt the words the same way. They came back out the side door into the cold Helena morning, and Tom looked at the sky and at the street and said, "The man in the gray coat is gone." Caleb scanned the block. Tom was right. The livery doorway was empty. He went to report. "Which means Dugan's men know we're here and that we went into the court building." Tom kept his voice level. "They'll move today. They won't wait to see what comes out of that meeting." Eleanor adjusted the leather bag on its cord, a gesture that had become automatic, but this time when she did it something was different. Her hand rested on it differently. Not clutching, just resting. The bag had been her lifeline for 3 weeks, and she had just put its contents on a judge's desk, and whatever came next, the weight of carrying it alone was gone. "The ledgers are with Breck," she said. "They have what they need to proceed regardless of what happens to me." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Caleb said. "I know." She said it simply, and he believed she meant it. "But I want to say it anyway. The evidence exists. It's in the right hands. Whatever Vance sends at us today, it doesn't change that." They were 2 blocks from May's boarding house when the trouble arrived. Not Dugan's men, someone else entirely. A man stepped out of the space between 2 buildings and stood in the center of the boardwalk, and Caleb recognized the quality of the positioning before he recognized the face. Deliberate, pre-planned. This man had known which route they'd take back to May's. He was about 45, well-dressed in the way of a city man who wanted to project authority, and his expression had the smoothed-over pleasantness that Eleanor had described when she'd talked about Harrison Vance. Not Vance himself, but the same school. "Miss Marsh," the man said. His voice was congenial and carried the particular warmth of something practiced. "My name is Gerald Fitch. I represent Mr. Harrison Vance in his capacity as owner of Vance Freight and Transport." Eleanor stopped. Caleb stepped slightly forward and left, and Tom slightly forward. And right, not dramatic movement, just the repositioning of men who have done this before. "Mr. Fitch," Eleanor said, "I wonder if we might speak privately." Fitch's gaze moved to Caleb and Tom with the expression of a man who considers other people's presence an inconvenience. Mr. Vance is prepared to be very reasonable. What does reasonable look like to Mr. Vance at this particular moment? Eleanor said. A full settlement of any wages owed, excellent references for future employment, and of course the return of company property. His eyes went to the leather bag. Mr. Vance understands that his former employee may have taken certain documents inadvertently during the confusion of her departure. Inadvertently, Eleanor said. These things happen. Fitch smiled. Mr. Vance holds no ill will. He simply wants his property returned and the matter closed. Tell me something, Mr. Fitch. Eleanor's voice was completely even. When Mr. Vance sent Ray Dugan's men to intercept us on the mountain road from Cascade County yesterday, was that also a gesture of no ill will? Fitch's smile didn't change, but something behind it did. I don't know what you're referring to. I think you do. Eleanor took one step forward. Mr. Vance's property, as you call it, is currently on Judge Arthur Breck's desk. It has been there for the past hour and a half. Judge Breck has already contacted the federal district attorney in Denver and the territorial marshal. Mr. Fitch, whatever you were sent here to offer me is approximately 2 hours too late. The smile went out of Fitch's face completely. What was underneath it was not pleasant. Miss Marsh, you are making a serious mistake. Mr. Vance has resources you cannot. I know exactly what resources Mr. Vance has, Eleanor said. I managed his financial records for 7 years. I know to the dollar what he has, and where it came from, and who he has paid, and for what purpose. All of that is also on Judge Breck's desk. She held Fitch's gaze without blinking. Go back to Harrison Vance, and tell him that the woman he thought would stay quiet has said everything there is to say to the people who needed to hear it. Tell him the ledgers are gone, and the case is filed, and the only conversation left to have is the one he'll have in federal court. Fitch stood very still for a moment. It's all. Then he looked at Caleb with the measuring look of a man considering options. Caleb met it with the flat patience of a man who has already decided how this goes, if it goes badly, and is simply waiting for the other party to make the same calculation. Fitch looked away first. He adjusted his coat, a small useless gesture of dignity, and said, You'll regret this. No, Eleanor said. I won't. Fitch walked back the way he came. Tom watched him go and said quietly, He'll telegraph Vance within the hour. Let him, Caleb said. There's nothing Vance can do now that will reach this court before Breck reaches him. Eleanor stood on the Helena boardwalk in the thin winter sun and watched Gerald Fitch's retreating back, and Caleb watched her watch him and saw the thing he'd been waiting to see since she stepped off the stagecoach in Redstone Crossing. Not triumph. Something quieter and more permanent than triumph. The particular stillness of a person who has set down something very heavy and is standing in the first moment of not carrying it. She turned around and looked at Caleb, and her eyes were bright, and her jaw was set, and she looked like a woman who had just finished a 7-year war and was not entirely sure what to do with her hands. May said there was breakfast, Caleb said. Eleanor laughed. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh without reservation, without it being cut short or swallowed back, and it was genuine and a little rough and entirely itself. Yes, she said. Let's go have breakfast. 2 days later, Judge Breck filed a federal criminal complaint against Harrison Vance on 14 counts of fraud, 3 counts of bribery of public officials, and 2 counts of criminal conspiracy. The filing named 64 victims by name. It named Thomas Wendell and Martin Price, and 2 other officials whose names Eleanor had found in the ledgers and whom she had described to Breck with the same methodical precision she brought to everything. The Denver newspapers ran the story on the 3rd day. The Helena papers ran it on the 4th. By the end of the first week, 3 additional women who had worked for Vance's operation had contacted Holt's office with their own accounts, not financial records, but testimony, the kind that filled in the human cost of the numbers Eleanor had documented. Eleanor read every statement. She sat at May's kitchen table and read them with her coffee going cold beside her. and when she finished, she sat quietly for a long time. Caleb sat across from her and waited. He had gotten good at waiting in the particular way Eleanor needed present, but not pressing, available, but not hovering. "They were all afraid to speak first," she finally said. "All three of them. They'd been afraid for years." She touched the edge of the last statement. "One of them said she read about the filing in the newspaper and cried for an hour because she thought she was the only one." "She wasn't," Caleb said. "No, none of us were." Eleanor looked up. "That's the thing about men like Vance. They make each person feel alone and specific, and like the shame belongs only to them. They depend on that isolation. It's the architecture of the whole operation." She paused. "When the isolation breaks, the rest follows." "You broke it." "We broke it," she said, and it was not a correction out of courtesy. It was accurate, and she meant it to be. Tom rode back to Redstone Crossing on the 5th day with a letter for Curtis and Pete explaining the situation and asking Tom to check the eastern Boundary Creek crossing when he returned, which Tom said he would do, and which Caleb knew he would because Tom did what he said. He left early and rode north, and the house felt different after, in the way that spaces feel different when someone reliable has gone out of them. On the 6th morning, Eleanor came downstairs with her hair down, which was the first time Caleb had seen it, and she was carrying the leather bag still on its cord, but holding it differently loose, like something she was wearing out of habit rather than necessity. She sat at the kitchen table and looked at the bag and then took it off and set it on the table and looked at it, sitting there separate from her body. "It'll need to stay here," she said. "Until the trial. Breck wants the originals in his custody, but I should be available for the prosecution as primary witness." She traced the edge of the bag with one finger. "That'll be months." "I know. I can't go back to Denver. Vance's legal team will try to suppress testimony, and if I'm accessible and alone, they'll try to pressure me directly." She paused. "Breck recommended I stay in the territory under the protection of someone with established local standing." She looked at him carefully. "He was fairly specific about the someone." "Was he?" "He said, and I'm quoting directly, that the rancher from Cascade County who came in ahead of me to prepare the meeting had the look of a man who knew how to protect what mattered to him." Eleanor's voice was precise, and her eyes were entirely alert. "He said he'd feel more confident about witness safety if that rancher was nearby." "Breck's a practical man," Caleb said. "He is." She looked at her hands, the bandaged one and the one that had healed, both of them capable and calloused and not trembling. "Redstone Crossing needs a teacher." "It does." "And the Hargrove Ranch has a study." "It does." "And you placed an advertisement," she said carefully, "that I answered under false pretenses and for reasons that had nothing to do with what it offered." "Yes." Eleanor looked at him across the kitchen table with 7 ledger books between them and a dead fire in the grate and the Helena morning coming through the window and said, "I'd like to answer it honestly now, if it's still open." Caleb looked at her for a long moment, at the gray eyes that had read everything and missed nothing, and decided somewhere between a mountain road and a judge's desk and a man on a boardwalk who had come 2 hours too late that this was a person worth trusting with the real answer. "It's still open," he said. Eleanor reached across the table and took his hand. Not grabbing, just taking it the way she'd started taking things that belonged to her deliberately and without apology. "Then I accept your offer, Mr. Hargrove," she said, "the real one." The Harrison-Vance trial lasted 11 days in federal court and ended with a conviction on all 14 counts. Gerald Fitch testified for the prosecution in exchange for reduced charges. Thomas Wendell cooperated fully. Martin Price did not and received the longer sentence as a result. 3 additional public officials were indicted in the months following. Vance himself sat through every day of the trial with the composed expression of a man who could not believe the world had organized itself against him, and on the day the verdict was read, that expression finally broke, and what was underneath it was not remorse, but the stunned incomprehension of someone who had operated so long without consequence that consequence had ceased to feel like a real possibility. Eleanor was in the courtroom when the verdict was read. She had testified for 2 days, organized and precise and unshakable under cross-examination, and when Vance's defense attorney had tried to characterize her as a disgruntled employee with a personal vendetta, she had looked at him with those gray eyes and said with complete calm that the ledgers were not a personal vendetta, they were financial records, and that the difference between the two was the difference between feeling and fact, and she had brought facts. Breck had almost smiled. She had seen it, and it had given her the 3 seconds of additional steadiness she needed to finish the answer. Caleb sat 3 rows behind her during the verdict. He watched her hear the word guilty spoken 14 times, and he watched her sit very still through all 14, and not cry, and not look around for reaction, and not perform anything for anyone in the room. She just sat and heard it, and let it be real. Afterward, outside the courthouse in the thin February sun, she stood beside him, and looked at the street and said nothing for a while. He let her have the silence because it was hers, and she'd earned it. 64 families, she finally said. Some of them will get restitution. Some of the money is gone and won't come back. Some of the damage is the kind that money doesn't fix. She paused. Is it enough? It's what was possible, Caleb said. That's what justice is. Not everything. What's possible? Eleanor looked at the street, at the ordinary people moving through their ordinary morning, unaware that anything in particular had ended or begun. My father said something once. He said the hardest thing about being a teacher wasn't the students who struggled. It was knowing you'd reached some of them and not others, and having to accept that the ones you didn't reach were still worth the trying. She turned to look at Caleb. I think that applies. It does. She took his arm, which she had not done before, and he felt the deliberateness of it, the same quality she brought to everything she chose. They walked down the courthouse steps into the February morning, and the trial was over, and the evidence was in the record, and the verdict was in the record, and Eleanor Marsh's 7 years of careful watching and 412 pages of documented truth were in the record, permanent and irrevocable, and belonging now not just to her, but to every person who would ever need them. They rode back to Redstone Crossing in early March, when the mountain road was passable again, taking 2 days and stopping at the same flat stretch below the tree line where they'd watered the horses on the way down. The valley was still white, but the creek was running under the ice, and the willows had the faint reddish tinge that meant spring was making its intentions known. Eleanor stood at the creek and looked down at the Hargrove Ranch in the valley below. The smoke from the kitchen chimney was visible. Curtis had apparently kept the stove going, which was more than Caleb had confidently predicted. Dorothy Payne said she'd help find the families who'd want to send children to a school, Eleanor said. She wrote me and Helena, said she had 7 names already. That's a good start. She also said Pete Dalloway has been cooking for 3 men and complaining about it constantly, and that Curtis Wade has been getting into arguments with Pete about the beans every single morning. That's accurate to my experience, Caleb said. Eleanor smiled, a full one not held back. It sounds like home, she said, and the word sat simply in the cold air, not weighted with anything she needed to qualify or explain or protect. They rode down into the valley as the afternoon light came sideways across the snow and made everything sharp-edged and clear, and when the ranch came into view, Curtis came out of the barn and waved with both arms like a man who has been waiting for something and is relieved it has finally arrived, and Pete appeared in the kitchen doorway and said nothing but went back inside, which meant he was already adding to whatever he was cooking. Eleanor dismounted in the yard and stood for a moment looking at the house and the barn and the creek line and the ridges above the valley. She had come here to disappear, and instead she had been found not by the man who meant her harm, but by the life that had been waiting for her to stop running long enough to let it begin. She reached back and took Caleb's hand without looking at him, the way people reach for things they've already decided belong to them, and she walked toward the house, and the warmth inside it, carrying nothing on her chest, and nothing in her hands except the future she had fought every mile of the way to earn. Some women arrive broken and leave healed. Eleanor Marsh arrived with the truth and stayed to build something worth living in, and that was not the end of her story. It was the truest beginning she had ever known.